which about 1 million is now youth unemployment. This is 1 million young people under the age of 25 are now unemployed. That's just over 1 in 5 people under the age of 25 in this country now unemployed. So it's a very serious economic situation here, and one that's getting appreciably worse. The government has chosen, in its wisdom, to put all the blame for this on the ongoing crisis in the Eurozone. It says that because about 40% of Britain's exports go to the Eurozone, any chaos that happens there reflects directly back onto what happens in this economy, and therefore it's not our fault that things are going wrong. It's all useless people, Sarkozy, Merkel, the Greeks, I mean just everybody over the other side of the English Channel, not being able to get their act together, and that's why the recession's worsening here. Now I think starting point is just to say, just before I say a few bits and pieces about the euro itself, just to point out what absolute nonsense this is. The recession that we're now heading back into in this country really began probably no more than 9 months ago, when it became very obvious that the government's own programme of spending cuts, particularly capital spending cuts, was having a dramatic knock-on effect throughout the rest of the economy. In particular, spending by households has been sliding for the last 9 months or so. Spending by businesses, that's business investment, has been on the slide for really some period of time before that. It recovered slightly in 2009, but has been on the slide again for the last few months. And it's only very, very recently that exports have started to turn south as well, driven by chaos in the Eurozone. So it's nothing to do with the Eurozone that we now have a big increase in unemployment. It's actually to do with what the government's been doing somewhere down the line. That the programme of spending cuts it's introduced has had a huge impact on the rest of the economy. That austerity doesn't just mean a reduction in government spending because of its knock-on impact, because it means that businesses sell less, which means that they employ fewer people, which means they cut wages, which means that everybody has less money. It has something economists call a multiplier effect, and that's now what's working itself out in the British economy. So if we're in a recession, and we are heading back into a recession, and possibly a serious one, it is because of what this government's doing, because of the policies it follows. Now, you should bear in mind this point about austerity and the impact it has on the rest of the economy, because it's something that comes up again and again when you're talking about the euro crisis. Now, let's start with this one. I think there's a couple of things that we need to say. First is that what's happening inside the Eurozone now is a continuation of the financial crisis of 2007-2008. It's a direct continuation of it. There isn't like some pause in events and everything's changed and now we're into some radically new and different crisis. The second thing is there's an awful lot of real nonsense that gets spouted about why there is a crisis inside the Eurozone. And typically, at least until recently, it's sort of hinged on a kind of story about the Greeks, really, and about how awful they are, that they're kind of lazy, they do no work, they spend more than they can actually earn, they have this massive bloated state that just lavishes, welfare services on these lazy Greeks who just sit around all day, really doing no work, unlike the hard-working Northern Europeans. And that was kind of the story about why Greece has such a big debt, and why that big debt is now a problem for the Eurozone in total. Now, I just want to say, I think it's from start to finish, this is nonsense, this is a fairy story. The reason the Greek debt crisis started to happen is because it's inside the euro. And the reason the euro crisis started to happen is because of the financial crisis prior to that. It's not that Greeks are lazy, it's not that the Greek state spend too much. If you go through the figures, you find that Greeks basically work the longest hours in Europe, certainly far longer than, say, French or Germans or people in this country. They work amongst the longest hours in the entire, that's ominous, but okay. They work amongst the longest hours inside the entire OECD, which is a club of developed countries apart from South Korea. That's the situation in Greek working hours. They retire later than Germans on average, and the Greek state is not particularly spendthrift. It spends less than the European average on welfare services. So all this stuff about it's the Greeks' fault and it's them that are making the situation worse for everybody else was complete nonsense. The reason there's a debt crisis appeared inside Europe is due to what happened in 2008, when the banking system essentially worldwide ground to a halt, when as a result of the bad debts that the banking system and major financial institutions have placed over the preceding 10 years, actually, as far back as that, these bad debts, these bad loans that they made, in particular to, people remember the subprime mortgage crash in the US, where major banks would hand out mortgages indirectly, but essentially hand out mortgages to people who, in many cases, had no job, had no income, had no other assets whatsoever, and then they give them a mortgage, say off you go and buy a home, and of course it turns out that these desperately poor people who had no income, no other assets, couldn't in fact pay their debt, they started to default. Those defaults built up, it rippled throughout the entire financial system, the whole thing crashes spectacularly with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Lehman Brothers was the third largest investment bank on the planet at the time. It filed for bankruptcy, and that kind of undermined the entire world financial system. Now, the government's response to this, absolutely everywhere, really starting in the UK actually, under Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, who were Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, was to say, we can't let the banking system collapse, we have to bail out the banks. And what that meant doing was mobilising the resources of the state, the ability of the state itself to borrow money to back up what banks have been doing. So you say, okay, you've got all these bad debts, we'll kind of take those bad debts on ourselves and prop you up with a whole load of borrowing and other forms of assistance. Now the total cost of this in the UK, if you add everything up, is about £1.3 trillion. It's an absolutely astronomical sum of money. And everywhere where this is attempted, you're talking about very, very significant sums of money. That's one side of it. The other side of it is because the banking system collapsed, it provoked a very, very sharp recession. Because there's a very sharp recession, you end up with governments getting less money in taxes and having to pay out more money in unemployment. So obviously deficits go up. They start borrowing more, spending more than you've actually got coming in taxes. So in other words, the reason that debts and deficits appear here and right the way across the developed world, certainly into the Eurozone, is because of the crash. It's not to do with how much governments were spending before the crash, it's to do with how much they had to spend because of the crash. And that leads to a big increase in deficits, big increase in debts, and that happens right the way across, really, the developed world, certainly across North America, including Britain, including the Eurozone. It happens kind of everywhere, with some exceptions in the kind of BRICS, in China and India and Brazil, and places outside of that core of the capitalist system. That happens absolutely everywhere. That's why you get the big increase in debt inside the Eurozone. That's one part of it. The other part of it is something rather complex that had taken place around the formation of the euro itself. And this is why the crisis is so severe inside the Eurozone, which is when the thing was set up back in 1999, following the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, when the thing was set up, basically it kind of compelled countries to hand over their control over monetary policy to the European Central Bank. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that it locked all the countries into exchange rates inside the Eurozone. Relative to each other, these countries would no longer have variable exchange rates, they'd all be locked in at certain levels. And because they were all locked in at certain levels, they were fixed in terms of competitiveness against each other. Because they're all fixed in terms of competitiveness against each other, the rates at which they entered in 1999 affected how they developed for the next